Dr. Elizabeth Hordge-Freeman, and we are so delighted to get to talk to her a little bit more because she has really gotten involved with our office quite a bit, Office of Community Engagement and Partnership. She started with a service learning mini grant, and things have built and built.
Yes.
So I really wanted to talk to you about sort of how connecting with our office has been helpful and some of the things that you're going to be doing going forward.
Great. No, your office, the Office of Community Engagement and Partnerships, has really been fundamental in allowing me to realize an idea that I had for a while. So with the mini grant, essentially it allowed me to convert my study abroad program to a global service learning program. And in that sense, it allowed me to engage students or connect USF students to Afro-Brazilian students in Brazil as language partners. And this was what I really enjoyed about the program is that it was a reciprocal program. So USF in Brazil students got to practice their Portuguese, students in Brazil got to develop their English, and so in that sense I think that both sides benefited. So it was really great experience both for me but also for the students.
That's wonderful. Another thing we'd really love to tell people more about is sort of how you actually use the grant. What were some of the things that you were able to do because of the grant?
So what was really important for me, so this was the second year of the USF in Brazil program, and so I wanted to incorporate Afro-Brazilian students much more than I had before. And so with the grant, I was allowed to incorporate them into all of our cultural excursions. So we had several day trips throughout the Bahia area. The Afro-Brazilian students came with us to these events. They learned both about areas that they had never been to before, but were also able to share and reflect on those experiences with our students. Apart from that, we had other activities, interactive activities that we planned at Quilombo Ilha, which is a location on the island of Itaparica. So that's an island that is located a bit distant from the city of Salvador. And so in many ways, people who live on the island don't really have access to the same resources as people who live in Salvador. So for them, many of them had never met a person from the United States. They'd never met a native English speaker. And that was really powerful because we had a group of about 80 students excited about learning about my research, but also engaging with USF in Brazil students.
That is so fantastic. And what was some of the feedback you got from some of the students on both sides?
So what's really been great is that, and I tell this to students, that one of the great things about service learning at the global scale is the importance of continuity. And so many of the students who were part of this formal service learning program actually participated in the first year of the USF in Brazil program. So many of the Afro-Brazilian students who were learning partners for the grant we'd worked with before, and so they had really great feedback about how quickly they've been able to learn English, how much better and how much more comfortable they felt using English because of these types of experiences. There's one student in particular who was a participant both this past summer and the summer before, and because her English had improved so quickly, she was actually invited by the World Cup to be part of their ambassadors program. And so those types of achievements are so gratifying because they offer concrete evidence that these programs are beneficial to the communities themselves.
Well, what I love about service learning and really what you're focusing on, I think, is the ripple effect that can take place.
Right. No, exactly. And what's so interesting about service learning is that I've had the pleasure of working with a fantastic partner, Brasil Cultural. So Javier Escudero is the director of Brasil Cultural. And so when I go to Brazil, these young women are part of my service learning program, but really his goal is to incorporate service learning in the other programs that he helps. So for example, this summer, if I'm not mistaken, Spelman College will be in Salvador. The College of Rochelle will be in Salvador, and they will also be participating in service learning. So the students who are able to learn from my program are also incorporated in these other programs. And so you really get the sense that there's continuity and not just a one-stop, come to this activity with us. We really want to train you to be able to be successful.
Yeah. To me, service learning is the absolute most important future for education.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we talk so much about, globalization and the global world and global interactions, and I think that it has to start now. Students have to really start getting these practical experiences so that they understand what that means and that they understand how to do this in a responsible way is the second part to that. So yeah.
Yes, well, we're so delighted to get to know you better and to get to do so many projects with you now.
No, I'm
really
excited. I'm excited about what might come in the future. OCEP has been just tremendous in terms of supporter and ally, so I'm looking forward to hopefully bringing other faculty members from my department into the fold so that they can also take advantage of all of what you have to offer. And I should mention, one of my colleagues, Imelda Curry, actually, I think she received a service learning grant to start a domestic program. So she works with local communities in the United States. So the idea that it might start with one faculty member, but the goal is that other faculty members really respond to the effectiveness of service learning in terms of outcomes. And so it's exciting to see that that's happened.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So I wanted to dive a little deeper into some of the issues around experiential learning and what are some of the things that happen when students study abroad and there's this whole new concept of volunteerism, and how can we avoid having our students be part of something that we feel is problematic?
Right. So, I mean, it's really exciting that USF students are so interested in incorporating this idea of global and local engagement. That's great. But you also have to think about sometimes when good intentions go wrong, right? And how can we avoid that how can we avoid some of those pitfalls from impacting our students? And so you mentioned volunteerism, and that's an interesting concept. And in some ways, it's not so new, right? Or it's not so new. In the 1990s or so, volunteerism really started picking up, right? So this is where people would pay to participate in service projects, typically in a global international setting. And while those intentions were good, there are significant problems with that. So in terms of USF students, I think that there are concrete recommendations that we can make so that they're better prepared to take advantage of these opportunities, but do so in a responsible way. And so in response to that, I basically came up with what I call my 4 C's of community engagement. So the first is it needs to be community centered. And that means that any projects that students get involved with needs to be in response to a demand or a need that the community itself has defined. Students should not be going in with their own ideas of what needs to happen, but rather should think about what the community needs. That also goes right into the second C, which is collaborative, right? So students are often very enthusiastic. They've learned a lot through their classes. They have lots of knowledge to share with others, but they also have lots of knowledge to learn, right? And so this is a collaborative effort, not students coming in and taking over, but rather being willing to learn and to be led. And sometimes that's difficult for students. And I think that, again, intentions may be good, but it's sometimes necessary to sit back and really respect the knowledge that the community offers. And so in that sense, collaborative work goes along with reciprocity, right? So reciprocity in the sense of recognizing the knowledge that local experts and community leaders bring and not assuming that students have all the answers. So I think that's really important. The third C that I have is criticality, right? Being willing to check yourself and check your privilege. This is a hard one for students because, like I said, many of them who participate in global engagement and local engagement are doing so because they want to make a difference. But it's sometimes difficult to ask themselves the harder questions about how their own privileges shape their experiences and the advantages that they have in life. But when thinking about this question of criticality, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond simply acknowledging I'm a privileged person. Really incorporating these ideas into your life means that you stand up and you demand inclusivity and equity in every situation that you find yourself in. And so that jump from recognizing, yes, I'm privileged, to I'm going to do something about it, I'm going to speak up, is sometimes difficult for students, but absolutely essential to some of the lessons that they can learn from service learning and community engagement. Then the last C is continuity, and this is a hard C. So this is related to students not just viewing community engagement as a one-stop cure for all. It's really about thinking about how they can foster sustainable relationships with communities. This doesn't mean that they can't participate in a service learning day or an activity for one day, but what it does call for students to do is think about how their interactions in this activity can impact other interactions, right? It's this idea that calling for inclusivity and equity is going to be important, not just on that day, but really for the rest of their lives. In some cases, you have students who are excited about global engagement, excited about going abroad, and I feel really uncomfortable when sometimes I see them post Facebook pictures of them and the brown and black children that they're with. And, in some ways they're used as photo opportunities. And that's exactly what is not acceptable, right? These are people who have knowledge, who have a life, who are real. And so in what ways can students respond to inequalities in a responsible way is precisely what I'm hoping to help them figure out how to do.
I went to a service learning conference at one point, and one of the faculty members said, one of my students said, I just hope my kids get to do this kind of a project helping the homeless. Well, no, the idea is let's try to solve some of these problems, not let's have a nice little service experience.
Right. Well, this really connects back to volunteerism, because in many ways the major critiques of volunteerism was that it was never about the community. It was about making people feel better about themselves somehow, making wealthy and privileged people feel better by doing what they think they should do, totally without thinking about any of these inequalities, or even thinking about trying to intervene in a way that would be meaningful for that very community. And so it's scary to think that I think many people do think that way. But part of our call as professors is to get students to understand that, to get them to acknowledge their privilege, but to take that a step further to say, how can we think about practical ways to intervene into some of the inequalities that we see? And that's a challenge, and it's an ongoing process for all of us, not even just for students. It's, even as a faculty member, I'm constantly asking myself, how can I really make the most of this abroad program? In what ways can I help? And so that's why after the programs are over, I typically meet with community partners to kind of discuss what's worked and what's not worked. So that's important.
Yes, this brings up so many more things to me. So what can be done about some of these sort of like 1 week projects where people go and it's kind of quick? What do they need to do to sustain something that they learn?
Well, so this is a really good question, because in some cases we also have to meet students where they are. Some students cannot go, for example, to Brazil every summer for the rest of their lives. That's not realistic. But what I am asking, or what I do believe that students can do, is find out a little bit more about the organizations with which they're working. Be clear on how their participation responds to actual community needs. And students typically should not have to pay organizations to volunteer, because we can imagine the money that they're spending to travel could probably be used for better causes than to bring them to these countries to build houses that they don't really know how to build. And so getting them to think about that is important. But even students who've already committed themselves to a project like this, and inevitably we have students who are watching this and maybe thinking, oh no, this is the project that I'm going on this summer. There are ways around that. I think that it's important to still use some of the principles that I mentioned in terms of being collaborative, being willing to be to serve rather than lead, and thinking about how perhaps missteps in selecting this program can inform future decisions. I think that's the best that we can do.
And what should people do when they get back? You sort of talked about once people return, how can they incorporate what they've learned into their lives?
So particularly those who engage in global activities are of interest to me, because I do research in Brazil. So I'm always excited when students tell me I'm going to Ecuador, to anywhere else in the summer. That's always exciting. But what the challenge is to do is to be willing to talk about these issues that are happening in global places, but do the same thing as it relates to local situations. And this is where it gets tricky. It's very easy for people to go to a different country and talk about poverty, inequality.
Exactly.
But what's interesting is that they don't do the same thing back home. And I think that's the challenge, is for students to really connect the global and the local. For me, that's been a theme in my own research. I'm getting ready to study, to go back to Brazil to do more research on modern slavery. And this is a huge issue that's so important to me, but it's also locally relevant because of human trafficking in Florida. So I absolutely see these things as tied. And so for me, that's my next step. A book on human trafficking is where I'd like to go after this Brazil project. And that's the way that I bridge these two areas.
That is so interesting. That my favorite presentation from a study abroad course when I went was where the student talked about what she observed when she was in India, and then how she tied it back to what was happening in tobacco farms locally, and how you don't necessarily realize it until you go away and then come back and see what's happening here.
No, exactly. I mean, I think the best example of this with me, so I study racial inequality in Brazil, and I write a lot about racial inequality in Brazil. And some of my friends were saying, I know you're going to be so glad when you get on the plane and go back to the United States. And I thought, I am looking forward to going back home. Except before I could even get home, I'm stopped at Miami airport and detained for over an hour and a half because they suspect that I am a drug mule. I have drugs in my bag. Yeah. And when I explained to them that I was a faculty member, they did not believe me. They didn't believe that I was a professor at USF. And so I think that there's so many ways that these ideas of inequalities that occur in the global scale are related to our local communities. And we really have to be honest enough to talk about them. And I think that by challenging students to think about their privilege, that's a first step to getting us to that point.
Well, this has been so helpful, and I think as people go out on their summer vacations and they're going on study abroad programs, they can think about these issues.
Absolutely.
So I really appreciate it.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we were talking a bit about service learning and how it's kind of the first step that helps people start to see what their life purpose might be also.
Right.
So and we have a student in common who took one of my classes and now is studying with you. So can we talk a little bit about the importance of continuity and how it's the first step?
Sure. And so I think that's probably the most exciting part about service learning. Service learning is not the end, but it really is the beginning of what we hope is a lifelong commitment to engagement and involvement. And so in many ways, taking one course for many students opens up a world of possibility for them. And so as faculty members, we get the privilege of really walking students through these processes, connecting them to other organizations that might also help to spark their interests. So I think it's really key for students to enroll in those initial classes, but it's also important that they understand that this is a process, that what they learn in these first classes is really just the beginning, that service learning represents a lifelong commitment to community involvement.
Yes, whenever there were certain problems, I would say, well, you guys are ambassadors now, and you can talk about what you've seen and see how we can make changes and what are the policy changes that need to take place.
Yeah, exactly. And what we're thinking about, as faculty members, we are in some ways fostering and training the future leaders. And so this becomes even more important for us to guide them in a way that allows them to understand and view community partners, as collaborators, rather than people on whom you research. And that's a very different approach. I think that if more policymakers had this more community-centered approach, many of the policies would be very different. Many of the approaches, many of the representations of certain groups would be very different because there would be a different understanding of how people deal with their circumstances.
I always have the students sort of write about what are some of the obstacles that you've been dealing with in trying to engage in this service, that it's not this perfect thing that's going to make you feel great.
Yeah, and the other thing too is asking students to identify what are some of the stereotypes that I had coming in. And so that type of self-reflexivity is hard because many of the students haven't necessarily been asked this. What are some of the stereotypes I had about certain groups, about certain locations, and how has this experience helped me to think beyond that? Those types of questions are hard questions that we have to ask, not just for students, but for faculty members as well. I mean, this is, I mentioned, a lifelong process. There's no faculty member who has ownership over perfect service learning. All of us have to view this as an opportunity to continue learning, to hone our skills so that we're able to provide an educational experience that is both enlightening for students, but also impacts communities in a positive way.
That's what I love about being able to do these interviews for the Office of Community Engagement and Partnerships, because we can kind of share and get best practices out there and learn from each other.
Exactly. And I think that fostering this type of collaborative work among faculty is important. It's hard to do because many of us are busy. We have these pretty tight research schedules, but it's really valuable considering what's at stake when we discuss community engagement at the local and global level.
Well, I think this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you.